The 1979 Vietnam War movie Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, is widely considered to be one of the greatest and most influential films of all times. But Coppola wasn't the first choice for director, and instead George Lucas intended to direct the film. He worked with the screenwriter John Milius for several years, but ultimately chose to instead work on American Graffiti and Star Wars. So perhaps it's not surprising then that in trying to brainstorm ideas for his Clone Wars novel focused on Mace Windu, Matthew Stover chose Apocalypse Now and its base story, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, as the inspiration for his novel to lend it a gritty feel. So I'm pretty certain that I read Shatterpoint when it came out because I was keen to read most of the Clone Wars novels to sort of fill in that gap between episodes 2 and 3. But all I really retained from it was that it was dark, and it was violent, and that it was focused on Mace Windu. So, a brief summary. The jungle planet of Haruun Kal, Mace Windu's homeworld that he barely remembers, has become a battleground between the Republic and the Separatist armies. So the Jedi Council dispatches Jedi Master Depa Billaba, Mace's former Padawan, to train the local tribesmen into a guerrilla movement. But Depa has vanished. And when news reaches Mace of terrible events on Haruun Kal, he must leave behind the Jedi and civilization to return to his homeland to seek out his former Padawan and learn the terrible price that must be paid when keepers of peace turn to war. So first, a brief timeline disclaimer. Depa is first sent to Haruun Kal 2 months after the events of the Battle of Geonosis, and Mace in turn goes to Haruun Kal to seek her out 4 months after that. So we can pretty accurately place Shatterpoint at 6 months into the Clone Wars, 6 months after Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And on an interesting note, my library copy of Shatterpoint on the inside had a timeline of the Clone Wars, which included placing Escape from Dagu 9 months into the Clone Wars. If you're not familiar, Escape from Dagu was a canceled novel by William C. Dietz that was supposed to involve Shaak Ti. Editor Meg here cutting in to say that I refer multiple times in this review to Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and it was only while I started editing that I realized maybe some of my viewers haven't read that novella before and are unfamiliar with the story. So, to be brief, it tells the story of a sailor named Marlowe who takes a job with a Belgian trading company in Africa, traveling up an unnamed river that is presumably the Congo River. It's a critique of European colonial rule in Africa, deals a lot of the dynamics of power and morality, and key to our understanding of it is Conrad's concept that there's no difference between civilized people and savages. As Marlowe travels upriver, he hears about a man named Mr. Kurtz. He hears a lot of very good things about him, but the more he travels, the more bad things he starts to hear, and he starts to wonder if instead Kurtz has descended into madness. So the way Shatterpoint is structured, we have an introduction and an afterword that are set on Coruscant and involve Mace Windu, Yoda, and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. The rest of the novel is broken up into 3 parts and is entirely set on Haruun Kal. And most interestingly, each of the chapters have chapter titles, something that we usually don't see in Star Wars books, and in fact I had not seen since Matthew Stover's Traitor in the New Jedi Order series. The first part, and in fact the first half of the book, involves Mace arriving on Haruun Kal, meeting up with Nick Rostu and Chalk and Besh and Lesh, and heading further into the jungle in search of Depa. Part 2 involves Mace traveling with Depa, intending that they're going to be picked up by Republic forces and get off Haruun Kal very soon. And then part 3 involves a big battle between the Korunai and the Balawai, the Highlanders, Uplanders, the natives of Haruun Kal, and the Offworlders, as well as a fair bit of separatist Republic interference into this battle. Mace also has some memories of Haruun Kal. He came as a teenager to participate in traditional rites and learning about their culture. He was taken as an infant into the Jedi Order, but it seems like while the Jedi aren't keen on attachments, they don't mind so much you learning about your heritage as long as you come back. But when Mace returns to Haruun Kal, he finds it very different than when he visited decades ago. Because this galaxy-wide conflict between the Republic and the Confederacy has drawn in smaller local conflicts as well. And on Haruun Kal, that is the summertime wars between the Korunai, the Uplanders, the Highlanders, the natives of the planet, and the Balawai, the Offworlders who have come because the jungles of Haruun Kal hold very valuable things, like wood and bark and all sorts of things like that. The summertime wars have been going on for decades at this point. It was mainly a seasonal conflict, but the Balawai siding with the Confederacy has made this more real and even more close to genocide than it was before. That the Balawai and the Korunai are not able to coexist peacefully. And it's reached a point where the Balawai are ready to just wipe all of the natives of Haruun Kal out. And if the Separatists are willing to give them weapons and ships to do so, they'll side with them quite happily. And I think that's what Mace struggles with for a lot of this book, is recognizing that what's happening on Haruun Kal isn't Republic versus the Separatists, that it goes deeper to that, to these ingrained conflicts that have just become a part of each culture. And Mace's viewpoint changes throughout the story. Not so much his viewpoint in general, but his viewpoint of the conflict on Haruun Kal. He comes in thinking that Depa and the ULF have done horrible things, and they have, but the Balawai have also done horrible things. No one is free of blame here. But at the same time, you really feel for the Korunai, who are not just seeing their way of life wiped out, but their entire existence. And the way the story is structured makes us really stay in Mace's head the whole time. We cut back and forth between limited third person, in which we're third person, so he did this, he did that, but we're clearly in Mace's viewpoint. And then entries from Mace's journals, which is something he does orally with a data pad. And those are obviously told in first person. This is an interesting choice. I felt like I enjoyed getting to have some of the journal entries, but it felt like a bit like Stover wanted to have his cake and eat it too, that he didn't want to write an entirely first-person narrative, but he wanted to have some sections of it, so we have the conceit of Mace recording his journal, which I'm not sure I always buy that he would be doing it in all of these situations, and in fact, it seems to be, as the story progresses, that this is happening chronologically, but a few times the entries will refer to later events, so it's almost as though he recorded them later to go back and talk about it, but he tells Nick that it's encrypted so he can't go back and alter entries. So the timeline of the journals was a little confusing to me, and they're really only here for the first two parts. Once we get to that climactic battle, for obvious reasons, Mace doesn't have time to record his thought. Mace also fights a lot. He's very good at fighting. He says at one point that he likes fighting, and I'm not sure if I believe that. I believe that Mace is a strong fighter, a warrior, especially since he invented a new style of lightsaber combat, Vapad. But I'm not sure that he enjoys it because he's always seemed more of a stoic character to me, that he's good at what he does, but he doesn't get the enjoyment out of it that Mace and Shatterpoint does at times. That Mace comes really close, I felt, to the dark side, especially in his fights. And what I preferred were the scenes where we saw a more thoughtful Mace. The Mace who's trying to save children, who's trying to get these Billaba civilians to safety, who looks at a situation and decides that restraint is the best option. That's the Mace I was really interested in learning about, and I wish we could have seen even more of that. I also liked his relationship with Depa Billaba, his Padawan, that he saved her as a young child and then he trained her for over 10 years. At this point, he sees himself not just as her former master, but almost as her father figure. The part of the reason why he's so upset about what has happened to her and wants to find her and bring her back to the Jedi Order is because he does feel responsible for her actions because he taught her. But perhaps because we see the story through Mace's eyes, I felt like we didn't get as much of Depa as I would have liked. When we encounter Depa in person in the second part, she's physically weak, she's suffering from headaches and nightmares, and she's falling apart before our eyes. And there are a few bits, especially in the third part, where Depa does amazing physical feats, but we don't really see them. She does them off screen, we'll catch a glimpse of it, and then we'll keep going, and then she collapses. And I would have liked to spend a little more time with Depa to see what a great Jedi she is, rather than just seeing her at her lowest point when the madness of the jungle has overtaken her and she just completely falls apart. In fact, I expected Depa to be the antagonist for most of the story, but instead we have a different main antagonist in the form of Vastor. Vastor is a Kurunai. He is from Mace Windu, like Mace. They seem to be the only two surviving members of this clan. And Kar's entire family was killed by Billaba. He was left in the forest alone as a teenager, and he survived. But as a result, he's become like this shaman, this strong user of the jungle force power. Because that's the interesting thing about Haruun Kal, all the natives have the ability to touch the Force. Mace is the only Jedi, the rest are untrained, but they do have this power. And in the case of Vastor, it's sheer, immense power. And the power of the jungle, it's not Sith, but it's decidedly dark. Which I guess makes sense. The jungle is deadly, it will kill you like its look at you, and to survive, Vastor has had to become like that. And Vastor's such a huge presence in the story that I did feel like he overshadowed Depa at times. That he sort of swallowed her up into his plans, and she had less of a mind of her own and was more doing what Vastor wanted. Mace's relationship with Vastor was also, it changed throughout the story. He was very opposed to Vastor, thought he was straight up evil, and then would work with him, and then was like, you're evil again. And it was like, I guess I liked what we got with Mace and Depa's relationship, and I would rather have had more of that and cut down a bit on Vastor and just his immense darkness. Of the other Kurunai characters we meet that Mace ends up traveling with, we have Nick Rostu, who's has a very smart mouth, but he's young, you know, he's snarky. Mace wants to punch him in the face a lot, but they end up working together fairly well. We have Chalk, poor Chalk, who just has lived through a lot and deserved better than what she got. So looking at Shatterpoint, my favorite part of Shatterpoint was honestly the first half. The first half I felt like integrated more of the bits from Heart of Darkness into it, that Mace is like the Marlowe character, the Captain Willard character, who's heading deep into the jungle to find the Jedi who's gone mad, to find the Kurtz character. And it's strange and it's unnerving, and he tries to do the right thing and it's hard, and he feels this dark pull on everything he does. And he comes to realizations about the history of the planet and how the separatists have inveigled themselves into it. And I was really enjoying the first half, but then I felt like the second half, and especially part 3, the big climactic battle at the end, started to lose me because it started to veer away from the inspiration that Heart of Darkness supplies. Mace is an interesting Marlowe-like character because he is both an outsider and an insider. He is a native of Haruun Kal, but he was only there as an infant and then for a brief time as a teenager. So he is also the outsider looking in, trying to figure out what is going on and why. And in the second part, he's talking with Depa a lot, and then he gets double-crossed by her. And then the third part especially, there was all this like military jargon, all the different missiles and ships and weapons, that it really lost my interest. I think especially because starting in the second and the third part, we had instances where Mace has a plan in mind, but he does not reveal it to the reader, and it's not until it plays out that we find out what he intended and why, and if it goes right or it goes wrong. And I can see how that would build suspense, but after it happened multiple times, I just started to get frustrated with it, that like, he's doing something and I don't quite know why, and I wish we got the explanation for it instead of, that's what I intended, Nick. And I'm like, okay, but like, you've done this multiple times now, like the one-on-one fight with Vastor and how he intended to beat all the forces that had arrived at the caves. And adding that to just the military jargon overload really made me start to lose my interest. I think too, the main point of Depa's story is to show how the Jedi are guardians of peace, and if you make them officers in a war, they're going to fall apart because that's not what they've been trained for, that's not what they've learned to use the Force for. Depa gets drawn into the conflict between the Kurunai and the Balawai. She can't separate herself from it. She's in too deep, and she loses her mind as a result. The Jedi were never intended to command military forces. They were intended to be peacekeepers, to be philosophers, to be scholars, and to have them conduct battles in the Clone Wars is the antithesis of what they're meant to do. But I feel like by the time we get to that final battle, it's been made very clear to the reader that that is the case. And I just felt fatigue reading what was happening because Shatterpoint is a very dark story. There's some humor from Nick Rostu's line, but on the whole, it's grim. And there is a lot of violence here. People get beheaded. Jungle itself is treacherous and dangerous, and there are wasps that get in your bloodstream and go up to your brain and just, oh, it's bad. But at the same time, I really love that concept of the jungle as just this dangerous force that is very Jedi-like of the Kurunai to figure out a way to exist within this world that constantly wants to kill them. I think for me, Shatterpoint is very like Star by Star in that I think it's an interesting story, but it's not a story I'd really want to revisit because it's just draining to read. Even at the end when Mace gets Depa back to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, It's like she's gone inside, that her body physically is okay, but her mind just isn't there anymore. And to watch a Jedi fall apart like that is really hard to read. So, in short, Shatterpoint exclusively focuses on Mace Windu's character, and how much you like Mace may dictate how much you like this story. It's super violent, it's super dark, and I feel like the second half and the last third or quarter especially suffers for being very much a war story with all the elements of a war story incorporated. But at the same time, I really like what Stover was attempting to tell here with this local conflict drawn up into the greater galaxy-wide conflict of the Clone Wars, that throughout the galaxy there will be other worlds where it's not so much the Separatists versus the Republic, but these long-standing grudges and conflicts coming back to the surface, or in the case of Haruun Kal, just becoming even worse and even more devastating. So next time, I'm going to be reading maybe the first video game tie-in novel within the Star Wars universe, Star Wars Galaxies: The Ruins of Dantooine by Veronica Whitney Robinson,